Okay, we're going to play a fun game this morning called I didn't charge any of my devices like I thought I did, and so they may all die in the middle of this, and we will be fully spirit-led about halfway through. But I'm hoping that they stay. I've got 3 of them trying to hedge here. This is our second week in the book of Jude. So last week we talked through how Jude wants us to combat false teaching, and he's kind of framing his whole argument, his whole letter, through identity, and really focuses on who the false teachers are, who we are, and who Jesus is. And so Jude believes these foundational truths will help us identify false teaching and stand strong against it. And so this week, we're going to focus, we read the whole letter of Jude last week. This week, we're going to read 3 verses. We're really going to just laser focus on 3 verses. And I would love to cover so much more of this. But just with time constraints, this is a dense letter, we're not going to be able to get there. But for 3 verses today, we're going to focus on 2 things that I want to convince you of. One, I want to convince you that Jude wants us to view certain events in the Old Testament a very specific way. And that if we view these events that way, it's going to not only change how we view the rest of the Bible, it's going to change the way we live as followers of Jesus. So let's dive into the book of Jude. We're going to look at verses 5 through 7 in chapter 1. So Jude chapter 1, 5 through 7. Now I want to remind you, although you came to know all these things once for all, that Jesus saved a people out of Egypt and later destroyed those who did not believe. And the angels who did not keep their own position, but abandoned their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains in deep darkness for the judgment on the great day. Likewise, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns committed sexual immorality and perversions and serve as an example by undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. These have probably not popped up in your Bible app as verses of the day, okay? You may not have read these before. You may not even be familiar with this story. How many of you have been to the eye doctor? Everybody? Most of us? Okay. So this is one of the most frustrating experiences for me because they sit you in the chair, they put the little dial in front of your face, and they put a bunch of letters on the wall, and they start changing the dial. And at least mine, I think most of them probably say better 2, better 2, better 3, better 3, better 4. And they're just kind of adjusting, and you're trying to figure out, can I see better or worse? And by the time I get to the end, I don't know if 4 was better or 1 was better. I have no idea. It's so confusing. But somehow, by the end, I actually can see better. I don't know how they do it, but they do. And so Jude here in verses 5 through 7, he's putting Genesis 6 on the wall. And he's inviting us to sit down while he just tweaks the dials a little bit. Because it seems like Jude believes if he can show us the right way to view Genesis 6, it's going to impact the way we view the rest of the Bible. Because frankly, if we get those verses wrong, a lot of the Bible comes out a little bit blurry. And we don't realize that because we don't know any better. But getting these verses right helps to focus our vision. And so the problem is a lot of Christians today don't even know about these verses. And if they do, they don't interpret them the right way. And so what I want to go through today is kind of a summary of Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, what happened, what is the most common take on this passage, and then what is Jude's take, and what do we do with that? So let's actually start by reading Genesis 6, 1 through 4, so that we have an idea of what Jude wants us to look at. So Genesis 6, 1 through 4. When mankind began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of mankind were beautiful, and they took any they chose as wives for themselves. And the Lord said, "My spirit will not remain with mankind forever, because they are corrupt. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth both in those days and afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of mankind, who bore children to them. They were the powerful men of old, the famous men, or some passages say the men of renown. Okay, so one view of this passage that is, I would say, and a lot of people would say is the most popular in the church today, it's called the Sethite view. And we're going to throw that up on the screen. And so the Sethite view was created in around 200s AD by a guy named Julius, but nobody really did anything with it. 200 years later, though, Augustine, who most of us have heard of, Augustine comes along and says, hey, I don't know what to do with Genesis 6. I don't really like what everybody else is saying about it. I wonder if anybody said anything else, has come to any other conclusions. And he figures out what this guy Julius wrote 200 years before. And he says, I like that. That matches with kind of how I want to view it. So Augustine writes some papers about this Sethite view, and that just takes off. And it becomes what is today the most dominant view of Genesis 6 in the church. But it started really with Augustine in the 400s AD. And so here is the idea behind the Sethite view. Somebody who subscribes to the Sethite view would say the sons of God that saw the beautiful women of men were descendants of Seth. They were righteous sons of Seth. Seth was Adam and Eve's good son after Abel. He was the replacement good son. And so they would say these sons of God, what it's really trying to say is Seth had a bunch of really righteous sons. But Cain's the bad dude. Cain had a bunch of evil daughters. And so these sons of Seth and these daughters of Cain got married. And it caused a bunch of craziness because God didn't want them to do that. And I'm not doing this view an injustice. This is the view. This is it. Start to finish, this is the view. And so righteous sons of Seth marry evil daughters of Cain. Why do they want it to say this? Two primary reasons. One, there's a discomfort with the idea that if these sons of God are anything other than humans, we got a weird situation here with babies being born to these sons of God and these daughters of men. What happened there? How could that happen? So that can't be. So we have to be dealing with two sets of humans here. So that's the main thrust for why the Sethite view is accepted. And number two, there's a passage in Matthew chapter 22 where Jesus says that angels don't marry and they're not given in marriage. And so they take that and say, hey, this couldn't have happened any other way because Jesus says that angels can't do that. And so they have an inability to reconcile Matthew 22 with Genesis 6. And so those are the main kind of heartburns of these proponents of the Sethite view. And so that is taken off. And even Lecrae, famous Christian rapper, I was so excited to watch a YouTube video with him where he was talking to somebody about Genesis 6 just recently. And this scholar completely rejected the idea that these were divine beings and fully embraced the Sethite view. Like, was all in, almost mocking the idea that it could be anything other than the Sethite view. And I've also seen a few other just random videos pop up. Of course, the internet knows that I want to see that stuff, but it's showing me recent videos and interviews where prominent people in the church are still promoting this view. This is not like some sort of forgotten thing. This is very prominent, today, widely believed. And in most churches, if it's taught, this is the way it will be taught. So there's the Sethite view. I have a helpful pie chart, which is going to show us what percentage of early church fathers believed this other view instead of something else. And as you can see, every single early church father, no exception, if they wrote about Genesis 6, they believed that these were divine beings. There's no exceptions. Can't find them. 100% of early church fathers believed that these were angelic beings. It wasn't until 400s when Augustine popularized another view that people started thinking something else. Okay, so, and also when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, lots of manuscripts reinforce this view that these were divine beings. So we know it wasn't just early church fathers, it wasn't just early Christians, it was widely believed, regardless of your religious persuasion, that when this event happened, it involved divine beings. So it was the earliest, most widely accepted view of Genesis 6 during Jesus' time. So how are we to understand this verse if we view it from the angelic view, which is the alternative to the Sethite view, and the earliest view? We have a slide to kind of walk through that. So in the angelic view, the supernatural sons of God rebel. Who are the sons of God? Well, this is a Hebrew phrase called B'nai Elohim, and it only appears 5 times in the Old Testament. There's lots of other ways to say children of God, sons of the Most High. You see that sprinkled throughout the Old Testament. The phrase sons of God is very specific, only appears 5 times. Twice in Genesis 6, 3 times in Job. And in Job, you see it twice where it says the sons of God were presenting before God with the Satan, with the accuser, to talk about Job. So it puts them in the heavenly realm interacting with God. And then also the third reference in Job is where Job references creation. And he talks about the morning stars singing together and the sons of God shouting with joy. So he places these sons of God at creation in Job. And so for starters, if the only places we see the sons of God outside of this passage put them in a supernatural context, a divine context, then the only way that Genesis 6 doesn't is if somehow it means something else in Genesis 6 that it doesn't mean everywhere else we see it. And so sons of God is exclusively a spiritual term to describe divine beings. So for starters, what they're called tells us these are not just humans. So what do these divine beings do? These were representatives of God to earth. Okay, God created them to bring him glory, to point humanity to him. He sends them as his representatives. And we see throughout the Bible that there's a divine order to the spirit realm. God is a God of order. We see in creation all the order that he institutes into earth. Well, he also has order in the realm we can't see, in the spirit world. And obviously, there are angels who deliver messages in the Bible. You see that. But there's a hierarchy of divine beings. And this specific group was supposed to be pointing glory to God. And we find this in other texts that we'll talk about. So God gave them influence and authority. But instead of using that influence and authority to be good stewards of the Father, they actually point humanity to themselves. They actually decide they would like the glory. And so Genesis 6 becomes not just about them violating their oath to God and intermarrying with humans. Other texts that we'll get into talk about how they taught mankind all kinds of evil. That it wasn't just a sexual romantic thing. They taught them violence. They taught them how to make weapons. They taught them how to use astrology to find their way with the stars. There's all these things that they taught humanity that pointed them away from God. And so they abandoned their position. So after they abandon their positions, they engage in this romantic behavior with human women, and they produce offspring. Okay, so this should cause us to ask a very reasonable question. How is it possible that a divine being can produce offspring with a human? Most of us in here generally know how this works. How could that have happened? Because this is the main hang-up with the Sethite view, the view that dominates the church today. The main hang-up is, how does this happen? I read a scholarly paper where the author says, this is hilarious, because the whole paper, he lays out the angelic view, and he says, if you were just looking at it from a theological, historical, biblical perspective, it makes total sense. It's the only explanation for Genesis 6 that works. But these beings have babies with humans, and I can't accept that that's possible, so that can't be the explanation. So everything hinges on this, solving this problem. So it's almost as if Jude anticipates this issue. Because if we go back to verses 5 through 7, he actually connects the events in Genesis 6 to another Old Testament event that we're going to look at. Let's see. Oh, I'm in Genesis. That's why I'm not finding that. So he says, likewise, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns committed sexual immorality and perversions, and serve as an example by undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. So that likewise means in the same way. So what did he say right before that? There are angels who didn't keep their position but abandoned their dwelling. In the same way, Sodom and Gomorrah was a similar event. So what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah? We're not going to walk through all of it. I'm just going to give you a very brief rundown. Basically, Abraham's out doing Abraham things, and 3 angels walk up to him, but they look like men. But he knows they're angels, and the Bible tells us they're angels. One of them actually is Jesus. So it's Jesus, 2 angels, they're walking up. Abraham sees them, bows down, says, hey, let me get you some water for your feet, to wash your feet. Let me get you some food. Like, sit down, take a rest. I'm going to take care of everything for you. So he does. Get some water. He kills a calf. He brings them milk. And Jesus and these angels, they eat and drink, and they wash their feet, which sound like very human things to be doing. So then the 2 angels go ahead to Sodom to rescue Lot. So Lot sees these angels at the beginning, and he says, hey, come to my house. Let me feed you. Let me give you something to drink. Why don't you rest? And so the angels, eventually say, okay. So Lot feeds them. They eat and drink. These are angels, but they're eating and drinking. So the men of Sodom come to Lot's door, and they start banging on the door saying, hey, why don't you send those guys out here? We would like to have our way with them. And Lot comes outside, shuts the door behind him, and says, like, hey, let's not do that. And, there's an exchange. Well, ultimately, the angels come out, and they pull Lot inside, they shut the door, and they strike all the men of that town with blindness so that they can't find the door. So these are angels. These are angels doing angel things. They have power, but they're also eating and drinking. And the men of the town wanted to be romantic with them. So for Jude to be sharing this story and connecting them seems to be Jude's way of saying, hey, this is possible, okay? You don't have to find another way to interpret this story, because the idea that divine beings could intermarry with humans is possible. It almost happened in Sodom. If you compare that to like Hebrews 13, that says we've entertained angels as guests without knowing it, or sometimes it says entertained angels unaware, we get the idea that divine beings interact with our world a lot more often than we may realize. We are in a physical world inside a spiritual world. So understanding this Genesis 6 event in light of Sodom and Gomorrah, which Jude connects for us intentionally, allows us to see, okay, the angelic view is plausible. Not only plausible, it's the most widely believed view. So what happens next? So they have babies. What are these babies normal? They're not normal. They're giants. We don't have a lot of time to dig into that. We don't have any time to dig into that. I would love to. But this is where the giants come from, okay? Several Dead Sea Scrolls talk about how giants are the offspring of man and the seed of holy ones. Okay, you see this throughout Old Testament, ancient Mesopotamian texts, okay? This is well known. So this is where the giants come from. And I'm not trying to just move past that like that's a nothing statement. I would love to dive into that more with you, but we just don't have time today. And catch me sometime, and we'll talk about it. So the other piece of the angelic story is that they accelerate evil by corrupting humans. So Genesis 1:5 tells us that there was so much evil on the earth that God regrets he even made man, because all that was on their minds was evil continually. How do you get from Genesis 1:4 to Genesis 1:5 if it's just good humans and bad humans marrying? How is half the population good, and then all of a sudden everybody's bad? So just another reason why the Sethite view doesn't hold up. But the part where they influence mankind for evil is not actually, that's not found in the biblical text, but it's found in other texts like 1 Enoch, which we talked about a little bit last week. I'm not going to read directly from 1 Enoch, but I do want to kind of summarize what Enoch says, just so we have the context. Enoch says that divine beings, he calls the watchers. Sons of God, watchers, sometimes called angels, all those things get used interchangeably here. Divine beings call, and watchers is actually an Aramaic term, and that's why it comes in. But again, story for another day. They swore an oath on a mountain called Mount Hermon, where they descended, and they corrupted humanity by teaching warfare, sorcery, astrology, and vanity. Their offspring were giants, most of whom were later destroyed in the flood. The angels were bound in darkness, but the spirits of their offspring, demons, still wander the earth. So these sons of God turned early humans into violent, drug-addicted, sex-crazed maniacs who took their spiritual direction from arts, from dark arts and the stars, instead of from God. And so this is a much more believable explanation to get from Genesis 4 to Genesis 5. How is the whole earth corrupt? Why does God send a flood? It doesn't sound that bad. When we really understand Genesis 6 in its ancient context, it was really bad. It was really, really bad, and it was the result of divine beings who left their proper post. They were supposed to represent God, bring glory to God. They led man astray. And so that's how we get to wickedness that just fills the earth and results in the flood. So beyond this, there are a few reasons for accepting the spiritual view, and then we will move on from this part. So if we move on to the next slide, logically, the Sethite view contradicts the verses that follow it. Okay, we go from half the people are righteous, sons of Seth, to everybody's evil in one verse, and you just can't get there logically. Something else had to have happened. Academically, the Sethite view fails to account for the giants, also called Nephilim. You don't get giants from good people and bad people marrying. That doesn't explain how Genesis 1:4 says the giants were on the earth in those days. How? It just doesn't account for that. Theologically, it relies on a misunderstanding of Matthew 22. Jesus does say that angels do not marry and are not given in marriage. If you go back to Genesis 6, the phrasing there doesn't actually mean they got married. It describes romantic relations. And this is how they talked about it, but it doesn't require them to have actually gotten married, A. B, we've already learned that they left their proper position. They're rebelling against God. So even if they're not supposed to marry, it's entirely plausible that they did, and that was just another way that they rejected God's authority in Genesis 6. So Matthew 22 does not prevent us from understanding Genesis 6 with the angelic view. Biblically, it's the only explanation that accounts for the events that both Jude and Peter describe. Jude is pointing back to an event that was well known. You don't find another event like this in the Old Testament. There's no other event that talks about angels sinning in the Old Testament. Okay, and again, we could dive into Revelation 12 and the third of the angels fall, but it doesn't fit here. Just suffice to say it doesn't fit here. So Jude is pointing back to this event. Peter also writes, "For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them into hell, and delivered them in chains of utter darkness to be kept for judgment, and if he didn't spare the ancient world, but protected Noah, the preacher of righteousness, when he brought the flood on the world of the ungodly." So Peter is also describing this event where angels sin and they're cast into prison, and he's connecting it with the flood. So all signs point to Genesis 6 is an event where divine beings leave their proper place. They rebel against God, and they set humanity on a path of rebellion that you can trace from Genesis all the way to today. And these false teachers that Jude is talking about, they might be new, they're new false teachers, but this is an old rebellion. Okay, there's nothing new under the sun. This is simply a rejection of God's authority. So if we see Genesis 6 through the lens of Jude and Peter, we see this as a spiritual rebellion by divine beings that sets off this domino effect. And Jude is adjusting our sight on Genesis 6 so that we can see the rest of the Bible in light of this information. Personally, I couldn't believe how much richer the Bible seemed to me after I started diving into this information. It can seem scary to kind of wade into the unknown. Well, I don't know what the Bible says about this, and oftentimes we'll skip things that we don't understand. But when I really started diving into it, it made everything seem so much richer. And it didn't change the gospel, but it changed how I appreciate the gospel, because I'm seeing it from a spiritual perspective. And so in the interest of time, I'm just going to give you one example from the Gospels that shows what happens when you read the rest of the Bible through the lens of Genesis 6, like Jude wants us to. In Matthew 16, Jesus has just been baptized. He's been with the devil in the wilderness. Very early in his ministry, he goes to a place called Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi was known in those days as the gates of hell. There's a huge mountain there, and in that mountain is a cave, and the cave goes so deep that it was believed commonly that this is where you get to hell. This is the access point to hell. And the wilderness in general in those times was viewed as a place of demonic activity, stretching all the way back to the Israelites wandering around in the wilderness, Jericho, all those things. Those were all supernatural, demonic, spiritual forces that they were fighting against. And so long history of believing the wilderness is a place of spiritual warfare and demonic activity. So they're there in Caesarea Philippi, right in the middle of this, at the gates of hell. And this is where Jesus utters the famous phrase, "On this rock I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." And what's interesting is that rock, that mountain that they're standing at, is actually Mount Hermon, which is where the sons of God came down in Genesis 6. And Jesus marches his disciples to Mount Hermon, where the biggest act of rebellion, the most widespread act of rebellion arguably in the whole Bible, mankind gets set on a firestorm of evil, where that happens. And Jesus, very new into his ministry, walks them straight there and says, yep, this is the gates of hell, but I'm going to build my church here. And gates are not offensive components of war. They are defensive components of war. And Jesus is sending a message that I am going on the attack. This is a spiritual war. I am marching you to the gates of hell. I am marching you to the point where years ago, divine beings rebelled against me, rebelled against my authority, and set off a firestorm of rebellion that you can trace to today, to where we are now. And he says, I am building my church here, and we are going on the attack. And so if we view Jesus' ministry through the lens of spiritual warfare, through the lens of Genesis 6, we see he's not just going from town to town, teaching, healing people, making Costco-sized food multiplication. That's not what he's doing. It's what it looks like he's doing on the surface. Jesus is fighting a spiritual war every step of the way. Everything he is doing has a supernatural, spiritual context to it. He has a spiritual intentionality to everything he does that we miss if we don't understand the spiritual framework of the Bible that Jude is trying to open up for us. He's waging a holy war, and he's inviting us into it. And this way of looking at Genesis 6, this way of looking at Jesus' ministry, lines up really nicely with Jude's exhortation to contend for the faith. The false teaching of the world wants Jesus to be a good teacher. And it wants this to be a cosmic fortune cookie. And this will tell you how to live. But it also tells you why you're living. And spoiler alert, it's not for all this. There is a spiritual framework to the Bible that if we read it and understand it in that way will influence the way we live our lives. Look, I've tried to come up with an easy application for all this. But I've come, why does Jude want us to know this? I've come to the conclusion that this is not practical in any way. None of this is practical. I would love to be able to tie up Jude's letter in a nice bow in 2 weeks and tell you, here's the 2-sentence takeaway. But I don't think there is a neat little bow at the end of Jude's letter. I think maybe the point is that we look at the Bible and we want practical, but what we get is war. And not a political war, not a cultural war. Jude was writing in the middle. What's so interesting about this is Jude is writing in the middle of a political and cultural war. And he says, hey, I need to talk to you about something. It's not either of those things. It's a spiritual war that I want to talk to you about, because that is where your focus should be. There's a spiritual war happening around us, and we look at the Bible and we want practical tips for Christian living, and they're there. You can find that, but it's all wrapped up in the context of a spiritual war that we are to be engaging in. And if we look at it in that way, praying with your family for dinner is not just a good rhythm, it's warfare. Prioritizing how you spend your money is not just good sense, it's warfare. Baptism is an act of war. When Jesus died, Peter says that he went and visited these very divine beings who fell in Genesis 6. Again, lots of super weird stuff that you can dig into. He goes to hell, he goes to where they are, locked up in prison, and basically announces to them, hey, I won. Just in case you missed it, all the authority is mine again. I've got it back. Oh, and by the way, you're never leaving. There's no redemption for these divine beings, according to Peter and other ancient texts. Baptism is a reminder to the spiritual world that we will rise again. The evil will not, but we will. When we engage in coming up out of the water, we are sending shockwaves through the spiritual realm, that we are identifying with Jesus. We will live. They will not. It's an act of spiritual warfare. Communion is an act of spiritual warfare. Because Jesus' death on the cross was an act of spiritual warfare. Physically, sure. But what happened in the supernatural realm when Jesus died and rose again changed everything. When we leave every week, we quote the Great Commission, and the first few words of the Great Commission tell us what happened spiritually when Jesus rose again. All authority in heaven and on earth is given to me. And we say those words, and we memorize them, and we repeat them. But that statement wasn't said before Jesus died. God gave authority of the earth to these divine beings who were supposed to bring him glory, and they didn't do it. They did not fulfill their obligations. So Jesus comes not to dominate us, not to punish us, but to take back the authority that he delegated. And now it's his. And if we are his, then we take part in that authority. Communion is an act of war. Dedicating your children is an act of war. If you read Enoch, it says that these 200 divine beings land on Mount Hermon and they make a pact together. Because Shimja, or Kimihaza, there's a lot of different ways that his name's pronounced, he was kind of the lead rebel in this case, according to historical text. He says, hey, I want to do this because they're beautiful, but I'm not going to do this by myself, and I'm afraid you guys are going to kind of leave me hanging. So we're going to make a pact that we're all in this together. And so they do. They make this pact. The way we are to understand this pact should likely be as a dedication. They were dedicating themselves to this act. They were dedicating themselves to rebelling against the authority of God. And when we dedicate our children, we are dedicating them to the opposite. We are dedicating them to reject the rebellion of the Father and to come under his authority. So baby dedication, dedicating your children, is an act of spiritual warfare. Every decision you make has the opportunity to send shockwaves through the spiritual realm. Again, if you will adjust your views a little bit, you will adjust your view of not just Genesis 6, but the rest of the Bible, and read it from a spiritual perspective, you will see that every decision you make has the potential to influence the spirit realm. There are lots of Christians in the church today who are wearing the uniform, but they're not part of the fight. When Jude says to contend for the faith, he's talking about an ongoing fight for the faith. As we live, we are fighting for the faith. There are people wearing the uniform who are not in the fight. One of the most effective false teachings against the church today has been to blind the followers of Jesus to the spiritual implications of their everyday lives. And I will close with one of my favorite stories in the Bible, and I think it fits here. In 2 Kings, Elisha and his servant are surrounded by the army of Syria. Elijah's ticked off the king of Syria, and he brings an army and surrounds them. And the servant's freaking out, because all he can see are soldiers, as far as the eye can see. So Elijah prays and says, God, open up his eyes so that he can actually see. And when he does that, the servant looks up and he sees a divine army surrounding the human army. Chariots of fire, it says, and horses. He sees a glimpse into the spirit realm where God is in control. I think as Christians, we need to ask God to open our eyes to what is happening in the spiritual realm. We're not just here with everything we can see and touch. There's more to the Christian life than that. And in fact, if we're to take what Jude says seriously, we are actively engaged in a war. My best shot at practical is this. I pray that you will approach the Bible with a new perspective and begin to read it in the context of a spiritual framework. And as you go to work and go to school and interact with friends and family and play sports and go on vacation, in anything and everything you do from this day forward, that God will open your eyes to the spiritual war that is going on around you. That open my eyes to the spiritual war that is going on around us. That we will give up practical, comfortable Christianity and that we will engage. If we're followers of Jesus, we're wearing the uniform. But what are we doing? Are we contending for the faith like Jude says? Are we saving people from the fire as he closes his book? Contend for the faith, pull people from the fire. This is the urgent call to action that Jude has given us. Let me pray. Dear God, thank you for your word. Thank you that there is so much there that we can dive into. Reading the Bible in a year is impossible if we take it so much deeper than we actually do. I pray that we would prioritize getting to know your word, following your spirit, being under your authority and not the rebellion that has plagued humanity for so long. And I pray that we would prioritize saving others from the fire, prioritize engaging in this spiritual war, and that we would follow Jesus' example in that and take these words to Jude to heart. In Jesus' name, amen.